Kyle Richards has spent years living under the brightest lights of reality television. But what if the biggest chapter of her love life is the one she never wanted the cameras to fully capture? For years, fans of the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills have watched Kyle navigate marriage, separation, friendship drama, and rumors about her personal life. But behind the glamorous events and carefully chosen words, questions about Kyle's romantic life have continued to grow. And now, one question is impossible to ignore. Was there a love story Kyle tried to keep completely private? The speculation became even louder after Kyle's relationship with Mauricio Umansky began falling apart publicly. Suddenly, every old friendship, every unexplained connection, and every emotional moment was being examined again. Fans started asking whether Kyle had already emotionally moved on before her marriage officially changed. Then came the name that sent the rumor mill into overdrive: Morgan Wade. Kyle and Morgan's unusually close friendship became one of the most discussed relationships surrounding RHOBH. The two were repeatedly seen together. Kyle appeared in Morgan's music projects, and their undeniable chemistry sparked endless questions about whether their relationship was really just friendship. But here's the important part. Neither Kyle nor Morgan has publicly confirmed that they are in a romantic relationship. That means the most explosive theories remain speculation, not established fact. And that's exactly what makes this story so fascinating. Because Kyle has repeatedly pushed back against assumptions about her personal life, while fans continue analyzing every interaction for clues. Was Kyle simply protecting a close friendship? Was she exploring a new chapter in her life? Or did the public misunderstand the nature of their connection entirely? And then there's Mauricio. If Kyle's marriage was already changing when these questions started emerging, what was happening behind closed doors that viewers weren't seeing? Tonight, we are separating the confirmed details from the speculation and looking at why Kyle Richards' love life became one of the biggest mysteries surrounding Beverly Hills. Because sometimes the most intriguing celebrity love story isn't the one that gets confirmed. It's the one everyone keeps asking about. For years, Kyle Richards was known for keeping certain parts of her personal life carefully protected. She was comfortable discussing family. She was comfortable discussing the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. She was even willing to talk about difficult moments in her marriage. But when it came to her private emotional life, Kyle became noticeably more careful. And that difference is exactly what made her friendship with Morgan Wade so fascinating to viewers. It didn't begin as some huge public romance. It developed through friendship. Kyle and Morgan became increasingly close, spending time together and supporting each other's work. Kyle even appeared in Morgan's music video, creating an on-screen dynamic that immediately caught the attention of fans. And then the questions started. Why were they so close? Why did Kyle seem so comfortable around Morgan? Why did their friendship appear so emotionally intense? And most importantly, was there something happening that Kyle simply wasn't ready to discuss publicly? Those questions became even louder because Kyle was already going through major changes in her marriage to Mauricio Umansky. The timing made everything look connected. But timing isn't proof. That's something fans often forget when watching reality television. Two events can happen at the same time without one causing the other. Kyle's marriage was experiencing problems. Kyle developed a close friendship with Morgan. Fans connected the two. But that doesn't automatically mean Morgan was responsible for the changes in Kyle's marriage. In fact, Kyle repeatedly pushed back against the idea that the relationship was something viewers were assuming it was. She described Morgan as an important friend. Morgan herself also resisted being placed into a romantic storyline. Yet the speculation continued. And there was a reason. Their chemistry was obvious enough that audiences kept interpreting their interactions through a romantic lens. That's particularly true when celebrities appear comfortable with physical affection. A hug becomes evidence. A dinner becomes evidence. A vacation becomes evidence. A music video becomes evidence. Eventually, almost every interaction becomes part of the theory. But a theory isn't the same thing as confirmation. And Kyle understood that. She had spent years on reality television. She knew exactly how quickly an innocent moment could become a headline. That's probably why she became increasingly careful when discussing Morgan. Instead of feeding the speculation, Kyle often emphasized the importance of their friendship. And that created an unusual situation. The more she tried to clarify the relationship, the more some fans wondered whether she was hiding something. It's a classic celebrity paradox. If you talk openly, people analyze your words. If you stay silent, people analyze your silence. If you deny something, people ask why you needed to deny it. And if you refuse to answer, they assume the refusal means something. Kyle couldn't really win. But the bigger story was what her friendship with Morgan represented. Kyle was entering a completely different period of her life. For years, much of her public identity had been connected to being Mauricio's wife. Their marriage had been a central part of her story on RHOBH. They built a family. They built businesses. They became one of reality television's most recognizable couples. So when that relationship began changing, viewers naturally wanted to know what Kyle's next chapter would look like. And Morgan appeared during that transition. That doesn't prove romance. But it does explain why fans became so interested. Morgan wasn't simply another friend. She became associated with Kyle's transformation. Kyle appeared more independent. She seemed more willing to discuss her identity outside marriage. And she appeared determined to discover who she was without allowing other people to define her. That made the Morgan connection even more symbolic. For some fans, it represented a possible new relationship. For others, it represented Kyle finally allowing herself to build deep friendships outside the traditional expectations surrounding her marriage. And for Kyle herself, it may have simply been a meaningful friendship. That's the part outsiders cannot know for certain. Because the reality is that Kyle's private emotional life belongs to her. And unless she directly confirms something, fans shouldn't treat speculation as fact. But there was another reason the story became so explosive. Kyle's sexuality. Once fans began speculating about Morgan, the conversation quickly expanded beyond the relationship itself. People started asking whether Kyle was exploring her sexuality. Was she attracted to women? Was she questioning how she identified? Had she always known something about herself that she never publicly discussed? These are deeply personal questions. And Kyle has the right to answer them, or not answer them, on her own terms. What the public saw was Kyle developing an unusually close relationship with Morgan. What the public did not have was definitive confirmation of what that relationship meant romantically. That distinction became increasingly important as online speculation grew. Because once a celebrity's sexuality becomes a topic of public discussion, rumors can become invasive very quickly. A person's friendship shouldn't automatically become proof of their sexual identity. And a celebrity shouldn't have to publicly label themselves simply because viewers are curious. Kyle's situation became particularly interesting because she seemed to be navigating her identity while simultaneously dealing with the collapse of a long marriage. Those are two enormous life changes. And combining them created an irresistible storyline for reality television. But real life is more complicated than television. Kyle may have been discovering new things about herself. She may have simply been enjoying a close friendship. She may have been doing both. Only she knows. And that's exactly why the Morgan story remains so fascinating. The public saw something that looked different. Kyle experienced something that may have felt completely normal. And somewhere between those two perspectives, the rumors were born. But then another question emerged. If Kyle's friendship with Morgan was completely innocent, why did it become such a major source of tension and speculation around her marriage to Mauricio? That is where the story gets even more complicated. For years, Kyle Richards and Mauricio Umansky looked like one of the strongest couples connected to the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. They built a family together. They built businesses together. They appeared at events together. And for viewers, their marriage became one of the few relationships on the show that seemed capable of surviving the chaos surrounding them. But eventually, something changed. The cracks didn't appear overnight. Instead, viewers began noticing small differences. Kyle seemed more independent. Mauricio appeared increasingly focused on his own career. And the couple's public dynamic didn't always look the same. Then came the announcement that changed everything. Kyle and Mauricio were separated. But even that statement left fans with more questions than answers. Because the couple didn't immediately present their situation as a straightforward divorce. They were still connected. They were still co-parenting. They still appeared to care about each other. And that created a confusing middle ground. Were they separated? Were they trying to repair the marriage? Were they simply taking time apart? Or had the relationship already ended emotionally? The uncertainty became a major storyline. And then Morgan Wade entered the conversation. Suddenly, viewers had a possible explanation. Maybe Kyle had found someone else. Maybe Morgan was more than a friend. Maybe Kyle's marriage had changed because she had developed feelings for another person. But there was one major problem. There was never definitive public confirmation that Kyle and Morgan were romantically involved. That didn't stop the speculation. If anything, the uncertainty made it stronger. Fans began analyzing every appearance, every interview, every social media post, every moment between the two women. And the more they looked, the more clues they believed they found. But this is where reality television can become dangerous. Kyle's personal life was already being filmed and discussed. Now people were attempting to interpret her private emotions from public footage. And not every emotional moment has a secret explanation. Sometimes people become close because they genuinely connect. Sometimes friendship becomes a source of support during a difficult period. And sometimes a person needs a new circle of people while going through a major life transition. Kyle was dealing with the end, or possible transformation, of a marriage that had lasted for decades. That's enormous. During that kind of transition, finding someone who makes you feel understood can become incredibly important. Morgan appeared to provide that kind of friendship. And that alone could explain why they became so close. But fans wanted a more dramatic answer. They wanted the hidden love story. They wanted a revelation. They wanted to know whether Kyle had discovered something about herself. And eventually, the conversation became even more personal. People began questioning Kyle's sexuality. That is a subject where speculation should be treated especially carefully. Kyle is the only person who can decide how she identifies and whether she wants to discuss that publicly. A close friendship with another woman does not establish someone's sexuality. And rumors about someone's private identity shouldn't be presented as confirmed simply because viewers see chemistry. Still, Kyle's willingness to discuss questions about identity made fans even more curious. Rather than giving the internet a definitive answer, the situation remained complicated. And that ambiguity became part of the story. Meanwhile, Mauricio was also moving forward with his own life. He appeared on television. He pursued new opportunities. And his relationship with Kyle continued to evolve in the public eye. The situation became less about one person being the villain, and more about two people trying to figure out what their future looked like. That matters because celebrity breakups are often presented as a simple equation. One person did something. The other person reacted. Relationship ended. But long-term marriages rarely work that way. People grow. Priorities change. Communication changes. And sometimes two people, who once fit perfectly, discover that their lives no longer fit together in the same way. That doesn't mean their entire marriage was fake. It doesn't mean one person was secretly unhappy for years. And it doesn't mean someone else necessarily caused the separation. Those are assumptions. The same applies to Morgan. Her presence in Kyle's life may have been important. It may even have helped Kyle understand herself differently. But that doesn't automatically mean Morgan caused the marriage to fall apart. The timeline alone cannot prove that. And that's an important distinction when telling this story. Because the title says, Kyle Richards' hidden love story exposed. But the evidence available supports something more nuanced. Kyle developed a highly discussed friendship with Morgan during a period of major personal change, and fans began interpreting that friendship romantically. That's the confirmed framework. Everything beyond it needs to be presented as speculation. But there was another factor that made the story even more fascinating. Kyle and Morgan seemed comfortable with the attention. They didn't completely disappear from public view. They continued supporting each other. They continued appearing together. And that gave fans even more material to analyze. For some viewers, that behavior suggested confidence. For others, it suggested that the relationship was deeper than Kyle admitted. Again, neither interpretation proves what was happening privately. But the ambiguity kept the story alive. And Kyle was suddenly facing a completely different kind of attention. Instead of questions about Mauricio, viewers were asking questions about Kyle herself. Who was she? What did she want? What kind of relationship did she want? And what would her life look like outside the identity she had built as Mauricio's wife? Those questions may actually be more important than the Morgan rumors. Because after years of marriage, Kyle had to figure out who she was independently. That can be frightening. It can also be liberating. And perhaps that's why her friendship with Morgan became so meaningful. Whether romantic or not, it represented something new. A different kind of connection. A different environment. And perhaps a different version of Kyle. But the story didn't stop there. Because the more Kyle tried to move forward, the more her past seemed to follow her. Mauricio remained part of her life. Their family remained connected. Their history couldn't simply disappear. And Morgan's presence added another layer to that complicated situation. Now Kyle had to navigate three things simultaneously. Her history with Mauricio, her friendship with Morgan, and the public's obsession with figuring out what the friendship actually meant. That is an incredibly difficult position. Because no matter what Kyle said, someone was going to interpret it differently. If she called Morgan a friend, some fans wouldn't believe her. If she refused to discuss the relationship, people would assume she was hiding something. And if she openly discussed her feelings, every word could become another headline. So Kyle was essentially trapped between privacy and public curiosity. And that may explain why she chose to keep certain details to herself. After all, not every chapter of a person's life belongs to the audience. Some relationships are complicated. Some emotions take time to understand. And some answers don't need to be given immediately. But then another question began circulating. If Morgan was only a friend, why did the relationship become such a defining part of Kyle's post-Mauricio era? Was it simply because viewers were looking for something to explain the marriage? Or was there genuinely more to Kyle's emotional journey than she was ready to discuss? That question is where the story becomes even more intriguing. By this point, Kyle Richards wasn't simply dealing with questions about her marriage. She was dealing with questions about herself. And that distinction changed everything. For years, Kyle's public identity had been closely connected to being Mauricio Umansky's wife, a mother, and one of the central personalities on The Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. Then her marriage entered a completely different phase. Suddenly, viewers were watching Kyle make decisions independently. She was spending more time with different people. She appeared to be reconsidering what she wanted from the next chapter of her life. And standing prominently in that new chapter was Morgan Wade. That was enough to make fans curious. But the more attention the friendship received, the more complicated the conversation became. Because viewers weren't simply asking whether Kyle and Morgan were close. They were asking why they were so close. And that question is impossible to answer from photographs or television footage alone. A friendship can be emotionally intimate without being romantic. Two people can support each other through difficult periods without being partners. And someone can feel deeply connected to another person without wanting a relationship. But reality television encourages audiences to look for storylines. Every relationship becomes a potential plot. Every friendship becomes a possible alliance. And every unexplained connection becomes a mystery. Kyle understood that better than almost anyone. She had spent years watching viewers interpret her relationships with other women. She knew how quickly friendships could become storylines. So when the attention surrounding Morgan grew, Kyle had to decide how much she wanted to explain. And she generally kept certain aspects of the relationship private. That privacy created an interesting contradiction. Kyle wasn't necessarily hiding Morgan. She wasn't pretending Morgan didn't exist. They were publicly connected. They supported each other's work. They appeared together. But Kyle also didn't provide the definitive romantic confirmation that some fans were waiting for. And that created the perfect environment for speculation. The less definitive the answer, the more theories people created. Some viewers became convinced there was a secret romance. Others believed the friendship was simply being misunderstood. And some thought the relationship represented something more personal about Kyle's journey without necessarily being romantic. All three interpretations remained possible. But none could be treated as confirmed without Kyle saying so herself. Then the conversation moved toward Kyle's sexuality. This was perhaps the most sensitive part of the entire story. Because asking whether someone is exploring their sexuality is not the same as discussing their dating history. It's about identity. And identity belongs to the individual. Kyle has the right to define herself on her own terms. She doesn't owe viewers a label simply because they are curious. At the same time, Kyle's own willingness to discuss uncertainty around her personal life naturally encouraged more questions. Fans wondered whether she was discovering a side of herself that she had never publicly discussed before. But again, curiosity isn't confirmation. And that's an important line to maintain. The Morgan relationship may have been a friendship. It may have been something emotionally deeper. Kyle may have been questioning parts of herself. Or she may simply have been comfortable rejecting the expectations people had placed on her. Only Kyle truly knows. But regardless of the label, one thing became obvious. Morgan had become important to Kyle. And that alone was significant. Because after decades of being part of a marriage, Kyle was suddenly developing an identity outside that relationship. That can be a major emotional transition. For years, Kyle and Mauricio were presented as a unit. Even when they disagreed, viewers thought of them together. Their family was connected. Their careers intersected. Their public image was intertwined. So when that structure began changing, Kyle had to rebuild parts of her identity. And Morgan may have been one of the people who helped her through that transition. That doesn't automatically make Morgan a romantic partner. It simply means the friendship may have had emotional significance. And perhaps that's what fans were really responding to. They weren't necessarily seeing a secret affair. They were seeing Kyle become a different version of herself. More independent. More uncertain. More willing to question old expectations. And perhaps more willing to admit that she didn't have all the answers. That can be uncomfortable for someone who has spent years living publicly. Especially when millions of people think they already know who you are. Kyle's situation demonstrated how difficult it can be to change publicly. The audience remembers the old version of you. They remember your marriage. They remember your personality. They remember what you said years ago. And when you evolve, they want an explanation. But people don't always have one. Sometimes growth is messy. Sometimes identity evolves slowly. Sometimes a person doesn't know exactly what they want until they experience something new. And that may be part of Kyle's story. But the internet wanted a definitive answer. Was Morgan Kyle's girlfriend? Was she just her best friend? Was Kyle exploring her sexuality? Was Morgan simply helping Kyle through the breakup? The reality may be more complicated than any one label. And there was another reason the speculation refused to disappear. Kyle never completely stopped Morgan from being part of her public life. That kept fans interested. Because if the friendship were completely irrelevant, some viewers expected it to disappear. Instead, Morgan remained connected to Kyle's world. And every appearance created another wave of discussion. This became especially intense whenever Kyle was asked about Mauricio. Because viewers wanted to know whether Morgan had changed Kyle's feelings about her marriage. But again, correlation doesn't establish causation. Kyle's marriage was already experiencing problems. Morgan's friendship became more visible during the same general period. That doesn't prove one caused the other. The marriage could have been struggling independently. Kyle could have been searching for emotional support. And Morgan could have simply been there. That's a much more realistic possibility than the dramatic theory that one person suddenly destroyed a decades-long marriage. Yet dramatic theories are exactly what reality television audiences love. And that's where Kyle's story becomes difficult. She has to navigate her actual life while simultaneously dealing with the storyline people create around her. Imagine trying to understand your own emotions while millions of people are telling you what those emotions supposedly mean. That can be overwhelming. If Kyle says she's confused, people interpret the confusion. If she says she's happy, people ask why. If she says Morgan is a friend, people question the word. If she says nothing, people assume silence means confirmation. There is no easy answer. And perhaps that's why Kyle's story remains so fascinating. The mystery isn't necessarily whether she has a secret girlfriend. The deeper mystery is who Kyle is becoming after decades of being defined by marriage, family, and reality television. Morgan may be part of that journey. But she doesn't necessarily have to be the explanation for it. And that's an important distinction. Because when viewers focus too heavily on Morgan, they risk missing the bigger story. Kyle is entering a new stage of adulthood. Her marriage changed. Her children grew older. Her priorities evolved. And she is trying to determine what makes her happy. That's a story in itself. It doesn't need a scandal. It doesn't need a secret affair. And it doesn't need a villain. But then came another complication. Mauricio remained in Kyle's life. Their relationship wasn't simply erased. They still had family responsibilities. They still shared history. And they continued navigating their connection publicly. That made Kyle's friendship with Morgan even more interesting. Because it raised a difficult question. Can someone move forward emotionally while still maintaining a meaningful relationship with their former spouse? Absolutely. But it can also be complicated. Especially when the breakup isn't completely hostile. Kyle and Mauricio didn't fit neatly into the traditional breakup narrative. They weren't simply enemies. They weren't immediately divorced strangers. They were two people trying to figure out what their relationship meant after years together. And Morgan's presence existed within that uncertainty. That doesn't prove romance. But it explains why fans were watching so closely. They wanted to know whether Kyle's future had already begun while her past was still standing beside her. And that is where the story gets even more complicated. Because the next question isn't just about Morgan. It's about Mauricio. How did he really feel about Kyle's new friendship? Was he completely comfortable with it? Did the rumors create tension? Or did he understand that Kyle needed the freedom to discover who she was outside their marriage? The answer to that question could completely change how fans interpret Kyle's hidden love story. For years, Kyle Richards and Mauricio Umansky were presented as a united couple. They built a family together. They built businesses together. They appeared together on television. And despite the arguments that occasionally played out on the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills, there was always an underlying sense that they were a team. That image changed when their separation became public. Suddenly, viewers weren't just watching a marriage go through difficulties. They were watching two people redefine a relationship that had existed for decades. And then Morgan Wade became part of the conversation. That combination was enough to create endless speculation. Fans wanted to know whether Mauricio was uncomfortable with Kyle's friendship with Morgan. They wanted to know whether Kyle's closeness with Morgan had changed the marriage. And some viewers even wondered whether Mauricio believed there was something more happening. But there is a major problem with that storyline. There is no solid evidence establishing that Mauricio believed Kyle and Morgan were secretly involved romantically. That's an important distinction. A lot of the discussion came from viewers interpreting the situation rather than from a confirmed statement from Mauricio. And that means we have to separate what people saw from what they assumed. What viewers saw was Kyle becoming extremely close with Morgan during a major transition in her life. What they assumed was that the friendship must have been romantic. But Mauricio's feelings about the situation cannot be determined simply by looking at photographs or television footage. And that's where the story becomes more complicated. Because Mauricio and Kyle's separation existed independently of the Morgan rumors. Their marriage had already entered a difficult period. The couple had spent years balancing family, business, fame, and the pressures of reality television. Eventually, something changed. But long-term relationships rarely break down because of one single person or one isolated event. There are usually layers. Different expectations. Different priorities. Communication problems. Changes in identity. And sometimes simply the realization that two people are no longer moving in the same direction. That's why blaming Morgan for the separation oversimplifies the situation. Even if Kyle and Morgan had never met, Kyle and Mauricio still would have had to confront whatever problems existed within their marriage. Morgan may have become an important person in Kyle's life afterward. But that doesn't mean she caused the separation. And perhaps Mauricio understood that. The public image of Mauricio during this period was also complicated. He wasn't simply portrayed as an angry husband. He continued living his own life. He continued working. He continued spending time with his family. And he continued navigating his relationship with Kyle. That made the situation different from a traditional reality TV breakup. There wasn't a simple villain. There wasn't an obvious betrayal that explained everything. Instead, there were two people trying to determine what their relationship meant after years of marriage. And that's much harder for audiences to understand. Because reality television trains viewers to look for conflict. Someone has to be wrong. Someone has to be guilty. Someone has to reveal the secret. But real life doesn't always work that way. Sometimes two people simply reach a point where their relationship changes. And they have to decide what comes next. Kyle's friendship with Morgan may have become part of that new chapter. But it doesn't automatically explain everything that happened before it. That's why the phrase hidden love story can be misleading. There may be a hidden emotional journey. There may be aspects of Kyle's personal life that she hasn't publicly explained. But that doesn't mean there's a confirmed secret romance. And that's where responsible storytelling matters. Fans can speculate. They can ask questions. They can discuss chemistry. But speculation should not be presented as confirmation. Especially when the subject is someone's sexuality or private relationship. Kyle has the right to define that part of her life herself. And perhaps the most interesting thing about the entire situation is that Kyle seemed increasingly comfortable refusing to let the public define her. For years, she had a clear identity. Wife, mother, reality TV personality, businesswoman. Then the marriage changed. And suddenly those labels didn't tell the whole story anymore. Kyle had to figure out what came next. Morgan's friendship may have given her space to do that. Maybe Morgan understood her. Maybe she encouraged her. Maybe she simply offered companionship during a difficult period. Or perhaps there was an emotional connection that Kyle herself was still trying to understand. Again, only Kyle can answer that. But the fact that fans are still asking shows how powerful the storyline became. And Mauricio's role in that story is especially interesting because he represents the past Kyle is trying to redefine. Even if their relationship is no longer a traditional marriage, they still share history. They share family. They share memories. And they will likely remain connected in some way. That means Kyle's future cannot simply erase Mauricio. And Mauricio's future cannot simply erase Kyle. They have too much history for that. So where does Morgan fit? Possibly as a close friend. Possibly as someone who helped Kyle through a difficult transition. Or possibly as someone who became emotionally significant in ways Kyle has chosen not to fully explain. But again, there is no confirmed evidence here establishing a romantic relationship. That's why the real story may not be about discovering a secret lover. It may be about discovering a new Kyle. A Kyle who isn't defined entirely by her marriage. A Kyle who is willing to question expectations. A Kyle who is willing to form new relationships. And a Kyle who may not feel obligated to explain every part of her personal life to the public. That's a major shift. And it could explain why the Morgan story became so powerful. Fans weren't necessarily just interested in Morgan. They were interested in what Morgan represented. Freedom. Change. Independence. And perhaps the possibility that Kyle's life could look completely different than anyone expected. But there is still one question hanging over everything. If Kyle's friendship with Morgan was simply a friendship, why did it become such a major part of the public conversation? Why did viewers continue to interpret it romantically even after Kyle pushed back? And why did the speculation survive for so long? The answer may be simple. Because the audience never received a definitive ending. There was no dramatic confirmation. There was no dramatic denial that satisfied everyone. There was simply uncertainty. And uncertainty is exactly what keeps a celebrity rumor alive. Every new photograph creates another theory. Every new interview creates another interpretation. Every time Kyle and Morgan are seen together, the conversation starts again. But perhaps that's the point. Maybe Kyle doesn't need to give the audience an ending. Maybe this is simply a chapter of her life that belongs to her. And if she eventually chooses to explain exactly what Morgan meant to her, people will listen. Until then, the responsible conclusion is much more nuanced. Kyle Richards went through a major transformation in her personal life, developed a highly visible friendship with Morgan Wade, and became the subject of intense speculation about whether that friendship was romantic. The romance itself remains unconfirmed. But the impact of the friendship on Kyle's public image is undeniable. And that leaves us with one final question. Was Morgan really the secret love story everyone thinks she was? Or was she simply the person who helped Kyle discover that her life could exist beyond the marriage she had known for so long? At this point, the biggest mistake would be treating every rumor as a confirmed revelation. Because the truth is actually more interesting. Kyle Richards' life has clearly entered a different chapter, but the public still doesn't have definitive proof that Morgan Wade was secretly her romantic partner. What the public does know is that Morgan became an important person in Kyle's life during a period of enormous change. And that timing is what made people suspicious. Kyle was navigating the breakdown of her marriage to Mauricio. She was figuring out what independence looked like. She was spending more time with people outside her traditional circle. And Morgan was suddenly one of the most visible people beside her. That created a perfect storm. Fans saw the closeness. They saw the chemistry. They saw Kyle defending the friendship. And they started asking questions. But here's where the story gets complicated. Sometimes the person who helps you through the hardest chapter of your life isn't necessarily the person you end up dating. Sometimes they're simply the person who understands what you're going through. And after decades of marriage, Kyle may have needed exactly that. Someone who wasn't Mauricio. Someone who wasn't part of her old identity. Someone who could see Kyle as an individual rather than as half of a famous couple. That doesn't automatically make the relationship romantic. But it can make the relationship extremely meaningful. And perhaps that's what fans were actually seeing. A friendship that mattered. A friendship that arrived at exactly the right moment. A friendship that helped Kyle rethink what she wanted from life. That's enough to explain why Morgan became so important. But the internet wanted more. It wanted a secret. It wanted Kyle to admit that everything fans had suspected was true. And because Kyle didn't give them that confirmation, the speculation continued. That's how rumors survive. They don't need evidence if there is enough uncertainty. One person says, "They are just friends." Another says, "No way." Then someone posts an old photograph. Another person finds an interview. Someone else analyzes body language. And suddenly an entire narrative exists. But none of those pieces necessarily proves a romantic relationship. That's why the title, Kyle Richards' Hidden Love Story Exposed, should be understood as a storytelling angle rather than a factual claim. The hidden part may simply be Kyle's emotional journey. The love may refer to the deep affection and connection she developed with someone during a difficult period. And the exposed part may simply be the fact that fans finally started paying attention. Because Kyle's transformation is real regardless of what her relationship with Morgan actually was. She went from being part of one of reality television's most recognizable marriages to navigating a completely different identity. That is a major life transition. And perhaps the most important thing Kyle learned was that she didn't need to immediately define herself. She didn't have to announce a new relationship. She didn't have to choose a label. She didn't have to explain every emotion. She could simply take her time. That may be why Kyle resisted some of the assumptions surrounding Morgan. Maybe she didn't want a friendship reduced to a headline. Maybe she didn't want her sexuality turned into entertainment. Maybe she simply wasn't ready to define what the relationship meant. Or maybe the answer was much simpler. There was nothing romantic to define. That's a possibility fans often overlook. When a celebrity has obvious chemistry with someone, audiences assume romance because that's the easiest explanation. But human relationships are much more complicated. Two people can be incredibly close without being a couple. Two friends can travel together. They can support each other's careers. They can hug. They can appear in each other's projects. They can have inside jokes. None of that automatically proves romance. And Kyle has the right to decide what her relationship with Morgan means. The same applies to her sexuality. If Kyle ever chooses to discuss it openly, that's her decision. Until then, speculation shouldn't be treated as a revelation. And this is where the Mauricio angle becomes important again. Because even if Kyle and Morgan were simply friends, their friendship existed during a period when Kyle's marriage was changing. That alone would make the relationship emotionally significant. When a person is going through a major breakup, they often develop new friendships. They discover new interests. They reconsider old priorities. They become more independent. They sometimes surprise themselves. Kyle's story can be understood through that lens without assuming anything more. And perhaps Mauricio's role is not that of the jealous ex-husband people want him to be. Perhaps he is simply someone who shares decades of history with Kyle while both of them try to determine what their future relationship looks like. That's far more complicated than a simple love triangle. And it may also be healthier. Because if Kyle and Mauricio can maintain respect while redefining their relationship, they don't have to destroy everything they built together. They can acknowledge that the marriage changed while still recognizing the value of their shared history. And Kyle can continue building a life that reflects who she is now. That may be the real hidden love story. Not Kyle secretly choosing one person over another, but Kyle learning to choose herself. After years of being a wife, mother, reality star, and public figure, she is finally being forced to ask a much more personal question. Who am I when nobody else gets to define me? That question is much bigger than Morgan. It's bigger than Mauricio. And it's bigger than the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. Because Kyle's life is changing whether the audience understands every detail or not. Maybe Morgan will remain one of her closest friends. Maybe their relationship will evolve. Maybe Kyle will eventually fall in love with someone completely unexpected. Or maybe she will remain single for a while and simply enjoy her independence. All of those possibilities exist. And none of them need to be rushed. What matters is that Kyle gets to decide what happens next. And perhaps that's why the Morgan story became such a powerful topic. It challenged the image people had of Kyle. For years, viewers thought they understood her. Then suddenly, they were watching someone they couldn't easily categorize. And uncertainty can be uncomfortable. Especially for an audience accustomed to having every storyline explained by the end of a season. But real life doesn't have season finales. People don't always provide closure. Some questions remain unanswered. Some relationships remain undefined. Some chapters simply end without an explanation. And maybe Kyle's relationship with Morgan is one of those chapters. A meaningful connection that doesn't need a public label. A friendship that helped her through a major transition. Or something more personal that Kyle simply isn't ready to define. The truth is that we don't know. And saying we don't know isn't boring. It's honest. Because the strongest version of this story isn't pretending a rumor is confirmed. It's showing why the rumor became so powerful in the first place. Kyle's marriage changed. Morgan became important. The public noticed. Questions followed. And now Kyle's private life has become one of the biggest mysteries surrounding her. So what happens next? Will Kyle eventually explain exactly what Morgan meant to her? Will Mauricio and Kyle finally define their future? Will the friendship continue quietly away from the cameras? Or will another revelation completely change the story? Until Kyle herself decides to answer those questions, the mystery remains. And maybe that's exactly how she wants it. Because after spending years letting cameras into almost every corner of her life, Kyle Richards may finally be learning the value of keeping one chapter entirely her own. After all the speculation surrounding Kyle Richards and Morgan Wade, the biggest question is no longer simply, were they secretly together? The bigger question is, what does Kyle Richards actually want from her life now? Because regardless of what people believe about Morgan, Kyle has already entered a completely different chapter. Her marriage to Mauricio changed. Her public identity changed. And perhaps most importantly, the way she talks about herself changed. For years, Kyle was largely understood through the roles she played in other people's lives. She was Mauricio's wife. She was a mother. She was a sister. She was a cast member. She was a businesswoman. But now she's being forced to define herself without relying on the same labels. And that can be both frightening and exciting. The Morgan friendship became such a major story because it appeared during exactly this period of transformation. Kyle suddenly had someone who seemed to understand this new version of her. Someone outside the traditional structure of her marriage. Someone who wasn't simply connected to Mauricio or her family. And whether that connection was romantic or not, it clearly became meaningful enough for the public to notice. But there is a crucial difference between meaningful and romantic. That's the line that has been blurred throughout the entire controversy. A meaningful friendship can change someone's life. It can provide emotional support. It can encourage personal growth. It can make someone feel understood. And none of those things automatically make it a romantic relationship. That's why Kyle's situation shouldn't be reduced to one label. If she eventually chooses to say that Morgan was simply her friend, that should be accepted. If she someday explains that her feelings were more complicated, that should also be her decision. And if she never explains it at all, that's okay too. Celebrity status doesn't erase someone's right to privacy. In fact, Kyle's experience may demonstrate exactly why privacy matters. For years, cameras followed her through marriages, arguments, friendships, family issues, and personal struggles. Millions of viewers became invested in her life. But viewers being invested doesn't mean they are entitled to every private detail. Sometimes the most powerful thing a public figure can do is say, "This part of my life belongs to me." And perhaps that's what Kyle is doing now. At the same time, Mauricio remains part of her story. Their relationship may have changed, but their history hasn't disappeared. They built a family together. They experienced major successes together. They went through difficult moments together. And they will always share that history. So Kyle's next chapter doesn't necessarily require her to erase Mauricio. It may simply require her to redefine what he means in her life. That's another reason the idea of a simple love triangle doesn't really fit. Life after a long marriage isn't always husband versus new partner. Sometimes it's past relationship plus family plus friendship plus independence plus personal growth. All of those things can exist at once. And Kyle has to navigate them simultaneously. That's complicated enough without adding rumors. Then there is Morgan. What happens to their friendship? That's another unanswered question. If the friendship remains strong, fans will continue speculating. If they spend less time together, fans will speculate about that too. If they appear together publicly, the rumors will return. If they don't, people will ask whether they've fallen out. That's the downside of becoming part of a celebrity storyline. Once the public has created a narrative around you, almost anything can be interpreted as evidence. But perhaps Kyle and Morgan have already accepted that. Maybe they simply refuse to let outside speculation dictate their friendship. And that's arguably the healthiest response. Because if two people constantly change their behavior to satisfy online theories, they can lose control of their own lives. Kyle shouldn't have to distance herself from a friend just because people misunderstand the relationship. And she shouldn't have to prove the friendship is innocent either. The same applies to Morgan. She doesn't owe the public a romantic explanation. She doesn't owe anyone a label. And she doesn't need to participate in a storyline simply because reality TV fans want answers. The future may therefore be much quieter than the internet expects. Kyle could focus on her family, her career, her personal interests, her friendships, and her own emotional development. She could take time before entering another serious relationship. Or she could eventually find someone new. There is no way to know. But there is one thing that seems increasingly important. Kyle doesn't appear to need to rush. After decades in one marriage, she has an opportunity to understand what she wants before making another major commitment. And perhaps that is the biggest difference between this chapter and everything that came before. Kyle doesn't have to make a decision simply because the public wants one. She doesn't have to explain her sexuality because fans are asking. She doesn't have to define her relationship with Morgan. And she doesn't have to immediately replace the role Mauricio once played. She can simply exist in the uncertainty. That may actually be the most honest part of the story. Because people don't always know exactly what they want immediately after a major life change. Sometimes they need time. Sometimes friendships become more important. Sometimes old relationships evolve. Sometimes new feelings appear. And sometimes nothing dramatic happens at all. The internet may want a bombshell. But Kyle's real story may be much more human. She's figuring things out. And perhaps that's why so many people relate to the situation. Because underneath the Beverly Hills glamour is a woman trying to understand what comes next. The Morgan rumors may eventually disappear. The Mauricio storyline may eventually reach a clearer conclusion. And Kyle's future relationships may eventually become public. But until that happens, the responsible approach is to avoid pretending that speculation is proof. The most accurate conclusion right now is simple. Kyle Richards developed a very close friendship with Morgan Wade during a major transition in her life. That friendship became the subject of intense romantic speculation, but the supplied material does not establish that they were secretly a couple. Everything else remains interpretation. And maybe that's okay. Because the most interesting thing about Kyle's story isn't necessarily who she might love next. It's that she's finally being forced to ask what she wants for herself. Not what Mauricio wants. Not what the audience expects. Not what the Housewives cast thinks. And not what social media decides. What does Kyle want? That's the question that could define her next chapter. And if she eventually reveals the answer, the entire conversation could change. Maybe she'll confirm something nobody expected. Maybe she'll completely reject the rumors. Maybe she'll introduce a new partner. Or maybe she'll choose independence for a while. Whatever happens, one thing is certain. Kyle Richards' story isn't over. The marriage chapter may have changed. The Morgan chapter may continue or fade. But Kyle herself is still writing the next page. And perhaps the biggest hidden love story wasn't about secretly choosing another person at all. Maybe it was Kyle finally learning to choose herself. After everything we've discussed, the biggest question remains. Was Morgan Wade truly a secret love story? Or did fans turn an intense friendship into something much bigger? The confirmed picture is much more complicated. Kyle Richards went through a major transition in her marriage to Mauricio Umansky, developed a very close friendship with Morgan, and suddenly found herself at the center of intense speculation about her romantic life and sexuality. But there is no confirmed evidence in the material we've discussed proving that Kyle and Morgan were secretly a romantic couple. And that's important. Because Kyle's private life belongs to her. Maybe Morgan was simply the friend who helped Kyle through one of the most confusing periods of her life. Maybe there were feelings Kyle wasn't ready to define publicly. Or maybe the entire romantic theory was created by viewers who saw chemistry and filled in the blanks. Only Kyle knows the complete answer. So now I want to hear from you. Fire, do you think Kyle and Morgan were simply close friends? Fire, do you think Kyle was exploring a completely new side of herself? Fire, and do you think Mauricio and Kyle can eventually find peace after their marriage changed? Drop your opinion in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive, like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications because we are following every major celebrity storyline and every shocking development. Because sometimes the biggest secret isn't who someone is dating. It's who they are becoming when the cameras aren't telling the whole story.